So our culture is built on the shaky foundation of a terrible and convincing lie. And many of us here tonight believe that lie. We ate it and we drank it starting from an early age. The lie that has fed us and formed us is this. It's that worldly success, money, popularity, power, and prestige are the things that constitute the good life. It's the fabrication that influence and affluence and notoriety are the building blocks of a happy life. And because we're convinced that they'll make us happy, we're willing to sacrifice anything and everything to acquire them. You see, the root problem is that we're born into a broken system, and we can't escape it. It's in the air we breathe. Princeton campus culture, for the most part, is a meritocracy. It's a hierarchy based on performance. Princeton runs on competition. It thrives on it. You had to compete to get the chance to walk through the Fitz-Randolph gates on pre-raid, and then you have to compete for the next 4 years to walk through those very same gates on commencement day. You compete inside the classroom, you compete outside the classroom, you compete to get internships, you compete to get jobs, you compete to get into the right eating club. The fog of meritocracy is thick in Princeton. And many of you grew up thinking that you were perfect and everything that you did was perfect. I'm sure you absolutely dominated high school. You kind of had to get into Princeton. And you were told that everything you did was amazing. And then you arrived at Princeton and you realized that you're actually not the best or the brightest. You crushed high school, but then you get to Princeton and you feel like Princeton's crushing you. There are people who have traveled more places or are more well-read, have better experience, are more gifted, talented, intelligent, beautiful, more whatever than you are. This makes me think of one of my favorite fortune cookie sayings. I once had a fortune cookie that said this. It said, "Remember, you're unique just like everybody else." And at Princeton, everybody else's uniqueness just feels a little more superior to your own. And for many of you, your greatest fear is getting beat. It's failure. It's not achieving this or that, getting this grade or into that eating club. You probably felt this fear before you became a Princetonian, but it's only ratcheted up since you got here, especially since freshman campaign. And so you cannot allow yourselves to rest. You must work, you must work, you must keep on working harder and longer than him or her. Because if you rest, the competition will have a competitive advantage, or at least that's the fear. This meritocracy fuels the drive for greatness, oftentimes at the expense of our own souls. But this doesn't have to be your story. Tonight, I hope to provide you with a means of resistance against the soul-crushing nature of our world that runs on competition. I want to share with you the gift of Sabbath. And I think this is the second to last lecture in our series, Why the Good News. I want to argue that the gospel is good news because it offers us rest. The gospel gives us rest from having to prove ourselves. It gives us rest from having to define ourselves based on our accomplishments and from having to evaluate ourselves based on our performance and our production. The gospel offers us the gift of Sabbath rest. A few weeks ago, Scott gave an encounter talk, and he mentioned that if we really want the gospel to seep deep down into our lives, one of the things this will require is a new liturgy. We must adopt new rhythms in our life by replacing old deforming habits with new life-giving habits. And Sabbath, I think, is one of the most important disciplines to weave into the liturgy of your life. And I understand that talking about Sabbath may sound a little strange. Sabbath isn't something we hear much about. It's generally not one of the tools we talk about as essential for growing in our trust relationship with Jesus. In PFA, we talk a lot about prayer, we talk a lot about reading the Bible and fasting and serving and being in community. But Sabbath is not something we talk a whole lot about, and that's because we don't think much about Sabbath. You see, Sabbath is not a sexy topic. To the American imagination, Sabbath is associated with Puritanism, legalism, and moralism. It sounds depressing and boring. In a word, it's a big fat buzzkill. That's what most of us think. And I think part of the reason we think that is because we misunderstand what the Bible says about it. This improper understanding of the Bible has led to a bad theology, and bad theology inevitably leads to bad praxis. And in this case, that is not practicing the Sabbath. And as a result, I think we're missing out on the gift of rest that the gospel offers to us. And so here's my plan for the rest of the time tonight. First, I want to anticipate and refute a few objections to why you should keep the Sabbath. Secondly, I'll develop a theology of the Sabbath. And third, I'll explain a little bit about how to practice it. So the first objection is probably the most common one that you might be thinking right now, simply, I'm too busy. I've actually heard someone say, I would love to take a Sabbath if I wasn't so busy. I want you to note the irony in that statement. Sabbath is precisely for busy people. It's most important for those who are the busiest. Having a ton of work is not an excuse not to Sabbath. It's exactly the reason why you need it. The fact is, you're too busy not to Sabbath. The second objection is from the Bible. Oftentimes people think that Paul, the Apostle Paul, who wrote much of the New Testament, said that we don't have to keep the Sabbath any longer. And they'll point to a passage in Colossians, which we'll read, and we'll get to it in Bible course in due time. So Colossians 2:16, this is the chief passage in Paul's letters that people appeal to for the abolition of the Sabbath. And they use this sort of as the norming norm. This is the clearer passage, they think, that they use to interpret more obscure passages that relate to the Sabbath, like Romans 14:5 and Galatians 4:10. So I'll read it here for you. This is what Paul says in Colossians. He writes, "Therefore, let no one pass judgment on you in questions of food and drink, or with regard to a festival or a new moon or a Sabbath. These are a shadow of the things to come, but the substance belongs to Christ. Let no one disqualify you, insisting on asceticism and worship of angels, going on in detail about visions puffed up without reason by his sensuous mind." So there's a lot going on here. It's not exactly clear, and I don't think he's abolishing the Sabbath. But some argue that the language and logic in verse 17, this language that all these things are a shadow of the things to come, but the substance belongs to Christ. And what they're referring to there is the festivals and the new moon and the Sabbath. So some people think that all that stuff has been fulfilled in Jesus, but that's not true, and it's especially not true of the Sabbath. And we can see this particularly in a passage in Hebrews. You see, Sabbath was always a shadow of the things to come, and it remains as such. It has not been fulfilled in Jesus. At least not in a way that we have experienced that fulfillment. Sabbath has always pointed beyond itself, pointing to an ultimate rest that we will enjoy in the new heavens and the new earth. The substance indeed belongs to Christ, but it is not yet in our possession. And that's why the author of Hebrews can write this, that there still remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God. It has not been fulfilled, but awaits us in the future. And so he exhorts us, saying, "Let us therefore strive to enter that rest." And practicing the Sabbath week in and week out is one of the ways that we can live a faithful life of obedience and strive to enter that rest. You see, you can't understand this passage in Colossians without reference to Paul's polemic against the Colossian heresy, which I won't go into too much detail here. We'll get into it in Bible course. But basically what's happening is Paul is warring against the faulty view that to be a Christian requires something in addition to faith in Jesus. To be a Christian requires Jesus plus something else. And to the Colossian church, that was these ascetic practices and transcendent experiences. But in this passage, Paul isn't condemning the Sabbath or Sabbath keeping. He's condemning a perversion of Sabbath keeping. And the third objection is that Jesus didn't keep the Sabbath, and he said that we don't have to keep it either. So I'll deal with the first part, that Jesus didn't keep the Sabbath. Jesus did keep the Sabbath. It was part of his custom. His way of doing it just looked a whole lot different than the Pharisees and other religious people. But the Gospels are emphatic and regularly affirm that Jesus faithfully observed the Sabbath. When Jesus talks about the Sabbath, he's usually combating the Pharisees' legalism, not true Sabbath keeping. For the Pharisees, the Sabbath was just another rule to follow in order to earn God's favor and to look good while doing it. And so their legalistic observance of the Sabbath only brought death, but Jesus' observance of the Sabbath always brought life. Here's an example from Luke 13. On one particular Sabbath, Jesus was in the synagogue, and he lays his hands on a woman who had been disabled for 18 years. Her body was sort of bent up. She couldn't straighten herself. So he put his hands on her and healed her. And when the ruler of the synagogue saw it, he became indignant because Jesus healed on the Sabbath. And so he stood up and pontificated in front of the people, and he said this to the people. He said, "There are 6 days in which work ought to be done. Come on those days and be healed, and not on the Sabbath." And hear Jesus' response. Jesus answered him, "You hypocrites! Do not each of you on the Sabbath untie his ox or his donkey from the manger and lead it away to water?" You see, the religious people were more concerned about their livestock because those things brought them profit than they were about caring for people. And so he says, "And ought not this woman, a daughter of Abraham, who Satan bound for 18 years, be loosed from this bond on the Sabbath day?" And as he said these things, all his adversaries were put to shame, and all the people rejoiced at all the glorious things that were done by him. So why were the people rejoicing? Was it because Jesus abolished the Sabbath? No, it was because they finally had somebody who knew what the Sabbath was about. It was about life and wholeness and fullness and not death. Jesus isn't abolishing the Sabbath, and he hasn't abolished it. He's criticizing legalism, because legalism is the quickest way to kill the Sabbath. Jesus said, "The Sabbath is for human beings, not human beings for the Sabbath." This doesn't mean that we don't have to observe the Sabbath. This means that Sabbath serves us, we don't serve the Sabbath. The Sabbath is not something we have to do to be worthy of redemption. It's what we get to do after we've been redeemed. So those were some objections. Now I want to continue to make my case on why you should practice the Sabbath by developing a theology of Sabbath. And so first we'll look at the story of Sabbath's role in both creation and redemption. So first, creation. Sabbath is woven into the very fabric of creation. We see it in Genesis 1 and 2, the very beginning of the Bible. God created the world in 6 days and rested from his work on the seventh. In English, we get our word Sabbath from the Hebrew verb Shabbat. So I don't know if anyone's ever been to a Jewish synagogue, but when you go on Saturday morning to a Jewish synagogue, they say Shabbat Shalom, which just means like be at rest and be at peace. So we get our word Sabbath from Shabbat, just means to rest. God worked 6 days, and on the seventh day he Sabbathed. He rested. And he rested not because he was tired because of some sort of divine weariness, but he rested as a model for us to follow. You see, we're made in the image of God as human beings. We're made in God's image, and we're to incorporate this deep rhythm of creation in our lives, working and resting, working and resting, working for 6 days and sort of co-creating with the world, and then resting on the seventh. Because God is a Sabbath-keeping God, and so creation is to be marked with restfulness and not restlessness. One theologian says this: "For men and women created in the image of God, keeping Sabbath becomes a decisive, concrete, visible way of opting for and aligning with the God of rest." That's what we're doing in practicing the Sabbath. We're aligning with the God of creation. Sabbath is not just a prescription in the Old Testament law to hold us down. It's actually woven into the goodness of creation itself. And after Genesis 2, the next time we see Sabbath, the next time it appears in the Bible, is in Exodus, after God rescued Israel from Egyptian slavery. Try to recall the situation of God's people in Egypt that we read about in the book of Exodus. The Israelites were enslaved to unrelenting and capricious taskmasters, and they were forced to do back-breaking manual labor. They were brickmakers. Pharaoh built his empire on the backs of his slaves, the Israelites. But God heard the cries of his people, and he delivered them through a series of plagues and ultimately through the parting of the sea. And we call all of this the Exodus. We just get that name from the Greek word for going out. The Exodus marked a regime change. The Israelites were transferred from the rule of Pharaoh to being under the rule of Yahweh. And one of the expressions of this regime change was a change in labor policy. The Israelites were no longer slaves. Sabbath offers us the choice of slavery or freedom, and we see this in the Ten Commandments. The Ten Commandments are so often viewed, and incorrectly so, as this overbearing, burdensome list of do's and don'ts. But that's not how Israel would have understood them at all. The Ten Commandments are not a killjoy, but are actually the very way to joy. And this is especially true of the fourth commandment. That's the commandment to honor the Sabbath. And it's in both Exodus 20 and Deuteronomy 5. And I want to read part of the commandment, the fourth commandment, from Deuteronomy. And I want you to notice the connection between Sabbath and redemption, between Sabbath and the Exodus event. So this is what Moses wrote in Deuteronomy 5:12. It says, "Observe the Sabbath day to keep it holy, as the Lord your God commanded you. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work." It goes on to say, "You shall remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God brought you out from there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore," because God did that, because he redeemed you, "therefore the Lord your God commanded you to keep the Sabbath." Now think about that, how that would have hit the ears of former slaves. God is commanding you not to work, but to rest. Sabbath is not a burdensome command, it's a gift. It's a reminder of redemption, and so it is good news. Do you see this? When we Sabbath, we remember that we are slaves no longer. We are redeemed. The Sabbath is about freedom. It's not about law. One of my favorite theologians, her name is Marva Dawn. She's written a lot about Sabbath, and she says this. She says, "Sabbath keeping is about freedom. Sabbath keeping is not law." And this point is very important. God told us to keep the Sabbath holy, not because God wanted to spoil our fun, but because God wanted to deepen our joy. God wanted us to learn to rest. And for Princeton students, you need to learn to rest. You're all workaholics. 6 days you must work, but on the seventh day, you have the freedom of resting. And I think not wanting to rest means we'd rather be slaves. We're comfortable being slaves. We're used to it. The Sabbath is part of redemption, and it is a response to redemption. It provides the opportunity for us to choose freedom rather than slavery. You don't have to remain enslaved to the culture of competition. And here are a few more reasons why you should keep Sabbath. I'll just go through a few of them here. The first is that deep down, everyone knows that they need rest. Everyone knows that they need the Sabbath. Everyone craves the rest that Sabbath offers, except they tragically seek it in other places. And I think that's especially true here at Princeton. Princeton inherently knows that it needs rest. And as I've thought about it, that's one of the reasons why I think the street exists and is bustling on Thursdays and Saturday nights. After slaving away in competition, trying to perform and outperform one another in every arena of life, the crowds head down Prospect Street in search of release and reprieve. And what I think everyone's really searching for is the deep rest that Sabbath offers. And so a street life of partying and drinking is sort of an anti-Sabbath, is how I've started thinking about it. It's rest that doesn't restore, but makes us even more restless. Another reason to keep the Sabbath is resistance. And this is where the stick it to the man part comes in. Sabbath as resistance, pervading values of the world, resistance to the meritocracy. By stopping our work, we are in effect saying that we refuse to buy into the culture that says our value and our worth is determined by our production and achievement, by how much money we make and by how many things we can buy. It is, practicing the Sabbath is visible insistence that our lives are not defined by production. Sabbath is resistance to the temptation to fall back into the system of slavery and to being defined by the meritocracy. And that system is so tempting. It's all around us, it's all around you, and it's constantly trying to allure you and pull you back. And that's why we're to keep the Sabbath every single week. Next, after Sabbath as resistance, I think Sabbath is just a testimony to an alternate way of being in the world. I'm convinced that Sabbath was designed to be one of the defining characteristics of God's people always. Before the fallen world and after redemption. It was true at creation in the unfallen world before destruction and the degradation of sin. As image bearers, we are called to imitate God, working 6 days and then resting on the seventh. In a way, this is inseparable from what it means to bear the image of God, this rhythm of life. And it's especially true in redemption. Imagine the message it would be to Princeton's campus if there was truly a community of people who refused to be defined solely by their production and by their accomplishments. Of people who found their identity not in what they could do or their value in what they could do, but in Jesus. In Jesus' liberation and the redemption found through faith in him. I think by practicing the Sabbath, it frees us actually to love people and not to view them as competition, because we're not defined by beating them. It's a good thing, I think, but thinking about Princeton campus culture up until like a year or so ago with grade deflation, like your success at Princeton literally depended on you, on somebody else's failure. And so this is just everywhere here at Princeton. And I think that people are longing for rest, and Jesus is the rest that people are seeking. But if you haven't experienced the deep rest of Jesus, you trying to lead someone to him is like the blind leading the blind. How are we to give what we haven't ourselves first received? And I think faithfully keeping the Sabbath could actually bring people to Jesus. And last but not least, the last reason to practice the Sabbath is because I think it is just a tremendous gift God wants to give to his people. It creates the time and space to remember who we are, where our true value comes from, and to hear the voice of God. As one rabbi puts it, he says this about Sabbath. He says, Sabbath gives us back the world's most precious commodity, time. We have nowhere to go and nothing to do. We can just be. We can think, reflect, search our innermost selves to remember the essentials of life. Time to be with others and in community. Time to be with the Holy One. Time to be with oneself to remember who you are and who you want to be. Now, it would be great if I could just say, friends, go forth and rest. But the problem is we live in a culture, and you live on a campus that has set itself up as an institution not to value and to dismiss Sabbath as a good thing. Honoring the Sabbath will not come naturally, and it will not come easy. It must be practiced, and it will require persistence and a tremendous amount of patience with yourself. You're not going to nail it in the first week. And so towards nailing it eventually, I want to talk about just some practical things on how you can actually incorporate this rhythm of Sabbath into your life. So the first question I think that we have to answer is, when should I keep the Sabbath? And I think there are two answers to that. First is like right now. Life is not going to get easier, and it's not going to get less busy. As you get out of Princeton, the demands are just going to ramp up with family and work. So life's not going to get less busy. And if you can't be faithful now to it, what makes you think that you can be faithful later? I want to urge you not to rely on today's good intentions for tomorrow, but to remind you that faithfulness today is the best indication of faithfulness tomorrow. And the second way to answer the question, when should I practice the Sabbath, is just whatever day works for you. Like I said, the last thing you want to be with Sabbath is legalistic. I don't think, it kind of depends on your schedule. Saturday is probably a good day for people, maybe Sunday, could be Friday. It doesn't really matter, so long as you have a regular rhythm of 6 days of working and then the same day Sabbath. That's the most important thing. The day itself doesn't necessarily matter. Susan, my wife, she's up here over there. Our Sabbath goes from Saturday at 3 p.m. to Sunday at 3 p.m. That's just kind of what works for our schedule. So don't be legalistic. That's the last thing you should be with Sabbath. But find a day that works that you can incorporate into just a regular rhythm of your life. Next, just to get really practical, Marva Dawn, that theologian I mentioned before, she says that there's a four-way movement to Sabbath. And so she says Sabbath is marked by ceasing, by resting, by embracing, and by feasting. So Sabbath is not just things that we don't do. We actually do lots of things in Sabbath, like embracing and feasting, which I'll get at in a little bit. And the ceasing and resting and embracing and feasting, they're all kind of interrelated. So there's not necessarily an order, except for the first one. You have to cease. You have to stop doing things before you can really engage in the others. So I'll just walk through some of the movements, give a few practical tips just to give you a few things to run on, some tracks to run on as you incorporate it. So the first one is ceasing, and that just means stop working. Work is, for you, primarily schoolwork, and so a proper Sabbath would require you to put the books away. But anything else related to that drive, that need to find your value and your worth in accomplishing and being productive. So quit laboring at anything that is work, but there's probably a lot of activities that might seem like work to other people, but to you just are really life-giving, and you should incorporate those sorts of things into your Sabbath. So for me, like, I love to write. Some people hate writing, but one of my favorite things to do on the Sabbath is to write. That's not draining at all. It's one of my most favorite things in the world. So activities that are enjoyable, that are freeing, that are life-giving, those are the types of things that you want to do on the Sabbath. Those are good things. They're not necessarily work, even though it might be work to other people. So you cannot just stop with ceasing. You can't just stop with stopping, because Sabbath isn't a vacuum. It's not just about not doing things. It's to be a day of fullness that's not marked by business or busyness. So Sabbath is a day of fullness, but it's a day of fullness not marked by business or busyness. And so the next thing is rest. Sabbath is full of rest, and rest of every kind. We're not doulas, so that includes physical rest, spiritual rest, emotional rest, intellectual rest, social rest, any kind of rest that you want. And I think for most of you, that probably is going to look like Sabbath, because I know you all don't get a lot of sleep and you need to catch up on it. So if you spend a better part of your Sabbath just sleeping, I think that's a wonderful thing. It's not time wasted. It is time well spent. So you have permission to sleep during the Sabbath. You don't have to be doing things. You can rest. For me, the most important thing probably with regards to resting on my Sabbath is resting from technology. I think that I'm actually addicted to my iPhone, and if we're friends on Facebook, you'll see that I'm also addicted to Facebook. I post lots of things. And so for me, the temptation actually, we all kind of are like, oh, I posted a new thing. I get a lot of value in what people are liking or not liking. And I actually have to say, like, that is not how I'm going to be defined, and I have to say no to those things. I put my phone away, or I do my best to put my phone away. I don't check social media. I don't post things. I really do my best. I'm still practicing Sabbath. I haven't fully arrived. But that, for me, that's one of the best things that I can do is like close down my laptop, get my phone away, putting it away. And part of it is like some sort of ceremony. So putting a phone in a place where it's like that, it's there, it's gone, it's away, it's not just with me all the time. Because my habit, I'm constantly just pulling my phone. It's just like I'm literally addicted to it. I just look at it all of the time. So for me, part of resting is resting from technology, to get space to read a paper book and to write in my journal. I have a man journal. That's another thing I like to do on the Sabbath. Any other men in here have journals? Raise your hand. Yeah, okay, so you guys, yeah, okay, I like that. Journaling is very manly. Another thing is just socially. So depending if you're an introvert or an extrovert, if you're an introvert, probably getting away from people is a good thing. But if you're an extrovert, resting might mean just being with people. So whatever it means for you to be restored and refreshed, those are the type of things that you need to do for rest. The third one is embrace. This feels really nice, right? That word, embrace. A little bit nebulous, but after we cease and we rest, we sort of lean in. Is that one of the things now, leaning in? Or what's another the thing that's like leaning in? Press in. Yeah, embracing is all about pressing in. That's how I would define embracing. So embracing is about choosing, living very intentionally and choosing the right thing. So we embrace the Lord, and we do things like we worship the Lord. Maybe it's listening to worship music. Maybe it's praying more. Maybe it's reading the scriptures. Embrace one another, and that's not just hugging, although if you're a physical touch guy, you can hug one another. But it's embracing true friendship, spending time to be intentional with your relationships, and serving one another, doing acts of love and not just trying to have your world revolve around you. And when we embrace these types of things, we're reminded of our true identity and of God's will and God's calling in our lives. And the last thing is feasting. And this is my favorite part of Sabbath. Feasting is about celebration and engaging with things that just bring you life, things that make you happy, things that bring joy to your world. And so I think a guiding passage for this is Philippians 4:8. This is what Paul says. Finally, brothers, whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is just, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is commendable, if there's any excellence, if there's anything worthy of praise, think about these things. And I think we should feast on whatever fits into these categories, whatever that might mean for you. For Susan and me, our Sabbath usually just consists of, it's really pretty simple. We'll start tomorrow at 3, and we'll probably go for a walk, hang out with our little boy, take our dog out, maybe to the woods at the Institute of Advanced Studies. It usually involves us making dinner together, having good food and drink, and then probably watching a movie. I'm pretty tired after this week, so tomorrow will be pretty simple. Just quality time together. So you don't have to plan a ton of things. It really should be less planned and more open-handed, because probably for most of you, your lives are planned all of the time, and you have literally every 15-minute block planned out and allocated. So a Sabbath for you would probably mean just not having a full schedule. But it's up to you to decide. And of course, we go to church on Sabbath. That's what we do on Sunday morning. I usually teach Sunday school, and for me, that's not really work. I enjoy doing that. So that's part of my Sabbath. And then after that, we just kind of hang out until I have Bible course in the evening. So my best encouragement for you is to just start small and start really simply. And maybe even that might just look like 3 hours on a Saturday, or maybe 6 hours on a Saturday. Don't try to be too ambitious, and just work your way up. Put the books away, spend time doing the things that lead to rest and lead to joy, and try to do it together in community, because if you try to do it yourself, you're just not going to succeed. Now I'm going to end by talking about one of my favorite movies, The Chariots of Fire. Has anyone seen that movie? So it's an awesome movie. One of the great things about it is it's the soundtrack from the 1980s. It has like this amazing synth stuff going on. So if you don't like movies but you like soundtracks, it's worth watching just for that alone. But it won Best Picture, an Academy Award in 1981. It's an amazing movie. And the entire film can kind of be viewed as a case study on Sabbath. Chariots of Fire, it tells the story of two British athletes who are competing in the Olympic Games in Paris in 1924. And these two athletes, their orientation towards work and the Sabbath and towards work and their own self-image couldn't be more different. The first man, Eric Liddell, was a very devout Christian, and he was born to Scottish missionaries in China. And the second, his name was Harold Abrahams, and he was a Jewish undergraduate at Cambridge whose life goal was basically to overcome the anti-Semitism and class bias of his day. The film is a juxtaposition between these two men. Both were amazing, amazing runners, and both worked ridiculously hard. But the reason why they worked was very different. It couldn't be more starkly different. Eric Liddell saw his running as part of his worship of God, and his commitment to honoring God was so extreme that he refused to run his best race, which was the 100 meters, in the Olympics. He decided he wasn't going to do that event because one of the heats was on a Sunday, and he just wouldn't run on the Sabbath. Abrahams, on the other hand, was running to prove himself. His insatiable drive for excellence was fueled by this desire to prove that he was worthy to exist. I want you to listen to how each man described his deepest motivation for running. And think about what this tells about each of them. This is what Eric Liddell says. He says, and this is one of the best lines of any movie ever, he says, "I believe God made me for a purpose, but he also made me fast. And when I run, I feel his pleasure." And now listen to how different Harold Abrahams' motivation is for running. Abraham's best event was the 100 meters. It's the shortest race, and for fast people, that's finished in about 10 seconds. It'd probably take me like 24 seconds. But he says this is why he runs. He says, "I have 10 lonely seconds to justify my existence." Eric Liddell says, "I believe God made me for a purpose, but he also made me fast. And when I run, I feel God's pleasure." Harold Abraham says, "I have 10 lonely seconds to justify my existence." I watched this movie again this past week, and I've been thinking about it a lot. And as I've reflected on it, I've become convinced that these aren't sort of two paradigms where we're either one or the other. But I actually think that each of us are both of these men at different times. There are times when we buy into the meritocracy and we see our work as 10 lonely seconds to justify our existence. Then there are other times when we're more like Eric Liddell and we embrace a healthier view of work and rest. And when we work, we feel God's pleasure. And I trust every one of you would prefer your life to look more like Eric Liddell's rather than resembling Abraham's. And I think practicing the Sabbath can help tip the scales. And so towards that end, I challenge you with this. Practice the Sabbath. Give it a shot. Give it a shot for like a month. If you just do it once, you're like, actually, that wasn't so great. Give it a shot. Give it a shot for a whole month. Stick to it, and stick it to the man by resisting the lie that your worth is defined solely by the quantity and the quality of the things that you produce. I encourage you to weave Sabbath into the liturgy of your life. to embrace the fullness of life and rest that the gospel offers, because, as the writer of Hebrews says, there does indeed remain a Sabbath rest for the people of God. And so together, let us strive to enter that rest.